Nyamal, thank you so much for being on my YouTube channel today. Today, I'm very excited to be connecting with you for the first time since meeting in South Africa and talking about issues pertaining to the Ethiopian and Eritrean community, but also to the wider African community and Black diaspora as it relates to beauty standards, colorism, texturism, featureism, all the isms that really underpin culture and the way that we communicate with one another. Where we can start is maybe with a brief introduction to yourself, to your work, and kind of your hope for this conversation.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I think it was kind of like a serendipity moment in SA when we met. I am a daughter of the Nile Valley. I am also a daughter of the Sobat River. I come from an ancient people of Abyssinia and Kush. So I like to ground myself in that identity because it's not just the contemporary context that I come from. I come from a lineage of brilliant and strong people. I also like to ground myself in my native language, Tungnath. And so Nyamal Tudeal, and then Yanene Tanath, Bakanasir. Quite Lualton to be precise, and then Kagambele, and then Yamichi Pitadis, France Ilagasia. And yeah, that's who I am.
I love how intentional that was. So I guess I'll start with your identity, right? Like you said, we met at a human rights conference. It was really wonderful to meet you because one, you're a professor, so you just have a way of communicating that I love. And also for you to intentionally connect with me as an Ethiopian woman, because I think something that was really interesting was to be very, very transparent. You know, when Ethiopians and Eritreans see each other, it's not always certain how we're going to interact. It completely depends on the context. And that being said, I would love to hear more about just how you understand yourself within the current Ethiopian context, because you did reference Abyssinia, which is really interesting because that's very heavily associated with the Habesha identity. And how you feel when you connect with Eritreans and Ethiopians like we did in Johannesburg.
For me, identity is a big thing, right? Again, Ethiopia, there's been the federal identity politics that's kind of has trickled down into the current conflicts that are happening right now. And also those conflicts have trickled into Eritrea as well. First and foremost, I identify with my humanity as a human being in this planet, and also trying to live a decent life, to be a good ancestor when I'm no longer here, that my descendants can call on me and be like, oh, our ancestor was a good one, right? In terms of interacting with Eritreans, Ethiopians, I think for me it's not until COVID when I brought my Ethiopian identity and brought my own share to the tables, into the conversations, because again, I'm from the newer ethnic group, or the newer people in Ethiopia, and we're in the Gambela region, so we're a very small minority ethnic group. So I understand what it's like to not have privilege in Ethiopia. But then in South Sudan, we're the second largest ethnic group. So I know what it feels like to have privilege. In one of my countries, I don't have a large voice. I have to scream, or I have to get allies to get what I need across. And then in my other identity, I am the ally, right? And so I think for me, that's kind of where I connect, because I'm like, at the end of the day, regardless of the geopolitics that are happening, I still see the humanity in you as a human being. And the space where we were at was very much interconnected. So it was like, we're there to speak on the voices of those that cannot be at the microphone. And so it wouldn't take anything away from me to acknowledge that we're both there speaking for those people that didn't have the privilege to be in that space. When people want to pigeonhole me or put me into a space and said, oh, you're only South Sudanese, you can't be Ethiopian because you're too dark or whatever, and all of these things, I'm like, yeah, no, I'm all of them. Like, I'm a South Sudanese Ethiopian American if needed be. So that's me. Yeah.
I really, really, really loved you highlighting the dichotomy of your border identity, because I think that was something that honestly confronted me when you approached me. Well, actually, because I think I approached you, I asked you and your friend for a photo, and you're like, oh, by the way, I'm Ethiopian. And I was like, oh my gosh. You spoke a little bit about being a minority in Ethiopia, but how do you relate to other groups in Ethiopia? And how do you feel your relationship is with Eritrea as a non-Habesha Ethiopian?
So I think for me, my relationships differ because I didn't have the homogenous upbringing. It would be in Ethiopia, where I'm just around Habeshas or Eritreans and Addis. My dad was a judge in Gambela. He was moved to Yiteng, which was a refugee camp. So in '91, when the conflict, when Mengistu was being overthrown by Menles, war happened, we had to walk back to Sudan, and then another year we had to walk back to Ethiopia. So, I mean, I spent 1 year of my life in South Sudan, and then 9 years of my life in Ethiopia, and most of it in Addis, right? But even within that context, it was very much in a suburb. In Faransai Lagasi, I think I would call it suburbs, in the outskirts of like deep Addis. But then growing up in the US, where now my identity also had to shift because white people or white supremacy lens looked at me as an African American woman. Then having to do the historical work and the self-education of what that means being in the US. And so for me, it was very relating with Eritreans or Ethiopian is not that hard for me because, again, we were put in an environment where we all had to be together, where it was like, okay, you Black, I'm Black, you Ethiopian, you're Eritrean, you're Somali, we got to stick together. For me, it's always been like that. But then I grew up as a Seventh-day Adventist, and our church has always been very diverse. So I've never really saw the othering until I was othered when I was older, if it makes sense.
Interesting. Do you only feel like you felt othered when you were older, not when you were younger in Ethiopia?
Yeah, I think the only othering that I met was like, because I'm an Adventist, right? Whenever we'd come from church, the kids would wonder why was I going to church on Saturday and not Sunday, and why was I not wearing natala to, all of these things and being called pente, right? So that was the only time I felt other. But then at the time I was like, what does pente even mean, right? Because again, Amharic was my second language. It wasn't my first language. So I think that was the only time I've ever felt othered, not until I was an adult and I really understood the complexity of our people and who we are, and through the lens of colorism and through the lens of federal identity, and also being questioned. I don't know if you're familiar with this Ethiopian comedian called Filfilu. He was like a really big, came to the States, and then I went to the concert. My Amharic kind of leaves me and it comes back. Of course, when I'm in the community, my Amharic comes back. And so people are questioning, like, who is this South Sudanese lady? How does she know our culture? And and I'm just kind of like, oh, okay. We ended up going to the infamous, hookah spots. And it was New Year's also, Ethiopian, Eritrean New Year. And we were dancing, and I love culture, and I love culture through art. And so I can do Guraganya, Tigrinya, Walaitanya, of course, Kiskasa.
Okay.
Let's him. The shoulders
Also,
be
for
shoulder.
people watching who aren't familiar, she's naming all the tribes, so that's impressive.
All the dances, a few of the tribes that I know. And this guy was like, where do you learning my language, my culture? YouTube? I went off and asked him. I was like, who do you think I am? Like, Amarinya, like, I'm Ethiopian. And then my friends were like, you know what? Hold on. We got this. Step aside.
The person that I spoke to at the conference spoke a little bit to this because they still live in Addis. But in terms of like how people socialize, like in Addis, I understand that it seems like people, one, they hang out with each other across ethnicities, across everything, because it's very cosmopolitan. And two, I have learned that regardless of ethnic identity, a lot of people will identify with the word Habesha. And it seems like in Ethiopia, this word has really been taken on as a national identity. So I'd love to hear your perspective about that, and if you identify with the word Habesha.
As I was sharing with you, like, I had this conversation during COVID when we were having identity conversation and me owning my space as an Ethiopian woman, because again, media hasn't done Ethiopia or Eritrea any justice, because who they betray is the Ethiopian woman or the Eritrean woman is, the long hair, light skin, body, and all of these things. And they forget about all of us. There's so many different grouping and so many different ethnicities. So I push back again the word Habesha. I don't feel it encompasses me. Some other people may feel that it encompass them. But for me, I feel the word Habesha doesn't encompass me because of the way it has historically been used. So I push back against it. I'm like, yeah, I'm more of an Ethiopian woman. I'm not Habesha. But then I know that for when I'm in certain spaces and it's just used to group all of us, I don't go on to the to the politics of like, no, don't call me that. I was just like, okay, we move.
I feel like people every single day since I was a child, like I really, osmarino.com is a really famous Eritrean diaspora outlet. I remember adults arguing on there, are we Habesha, are we not Habesha? And I asked my uncle about it. He is Eritrean, but grew up in Addis, and he was saying that, well, one, if you're in Addis, you're probably just going to say Habesha because you're not going to try to distinguish on ethnicity, which is also, it seems like, reflected today with the ethnic tensions. But then in the diaspora, it's like people also wanted to avoid those conversations and still recognize, kind of like what you said, like, hey, I see you. And how do I name that? And so that's what's been really difficult in having this conversation is I really want to hold space and recognize that when you see someone, you know, there's a reason why we ask someone if they're Habesha, right? There's some level of truth to it. You can look Habesha, but like we have kind of been indicating, there's a longer history that comes with that people aren't comfortable speaking about. But to your point about not feeling comfortable with the term, did you ever use the term in Ethiopia, or have you always kind of kept it neutral and like stayed with the national identity?
Stayed with the national identity because for me, it's again like it really never encompassed me. I've never saw myself in the word. So then it's just kind of like, okay, like I'm in this space where everybody's like, oh, and she have a show. I'll just be like, sure, you know, and just move it because I don't have the energy to educate people. With my friendships, you know, we pretty much call ourselves, the endearing word, you know, onjo, minamin, all of that stuff. We never really just kind of like, oh, you're Habesha, because we understand it's loaded. It's a loaded word. And what does that mean? Many of us not seeing each other in the media, of being an Ethiopian woman. And then also I remember in 2014, I went back home and I went to Shoromida. Shoromida is like this open air market. At the time I had locks, and the person, basically these people, you know, the vendors and whatnot, they'll be like, oh, true African, you know, original African woman. And I'm just like, okay, where do you think I'm from? And they guessed every place but Ethiopia. Again, that's an issue with Addis, right? Because many people in Addis also don't understand that there is a life for other groups beyond Addis.
You have already been revitalizing so many conversations in the media, and you kind of indicated on this. But I know that you have had a level of involvement in Shades of Injera. So I'd love to hear more about your cultural storytelling and how you use social media to further representation.
So Shades of Injera was really interesting. It was a page founded by a friend of mine. I love the fact that, you know, we're interrupting culture, rethinking culture, what culture means to us. Because again, culture is positive and not positive at the same time. It was a space of how do we unpack them. So she was very much anonymous. She tagged me because she know that I am very open-minded, and I'm also, as an educator, I tend to speak up. So I basically, during COVID, Saturday night, we would get glass of wine. I think at some point it was like 3,000 deep on a live, you know. And then from there, we had difficult conversations, of course, when Ethiopia went into war, with the genesis of Achalu being killed. There was a Oromo sister and I that hopped on the live, and for her and I also to kind of hash out the conflicts that are happening with even our smaller groups, of feeling that we're not seen and all of these things.
Through all of the conversations that you've had on Shades of Injera, what do you think resonated with people the most? And what do you think people are most interested in hearing about at the moment in our community?
I think during that time, I was very much us seeing each other, because there were a lot of people that didn't realize that Ethiopia wasn't just 3 ethnic groups. And then the fact that I was able to hold a space and hold my Ethiopian identity was something that I felt a lot of people acknowledge. I still have people that follow me. I came to Accra and I was at a jazz club, and there was, I guess, a Habesha woman, right? An Ethiopian woman came up and she's like, oh my God, it's you. I watch you from Shades of Injera. And also I remember I went back to the US and I went to the soccer tournament, the one that was in DC. And I miss Esther Awaka by this much. I'm like, I need to see her before she, becomes an ancestor. Yeah, so I went there, and it was interesting having people from online that may not even have watched the live, because a few of the recordings have went viral on TikTok. So people just kind of like, oh, it's you, right? Thank you so much for having those conversations. One of the heavier conversation I had that I felt seen was, again, the colorism conversation, and also unpacking the word Barya or Baricho. And Barya means a slave. Yeah. So, and then for me in 2009, I went back to Ethiopia for the first time since my family was resettled as refugee in the US. And I went to the southern region, to Awasa. And I was trying to go to Amora Gadel, which is a park, there's monkeys, all of these things. And the guard would not let me in. And of course, ended up saying, this Barya, what is she doing here? And da da da. Yeah. So of course I walked back home, and then my entire family came to rain on the guard, And so for me, it felt that I didn't belong anywhere, because I'm like, if I'm at home, I'm also through the lens of colonization. As much as we as Ethiopian are very proud that we were never colonized, but the 5 years that the Italian occupied us has done a number mentally on us when it comes to the colorist notions. And so for me, it was very much like, where do I belong? Because if I come home, I'm still facing this barbaric othering. I give credit to the Most High, because I did not consider bleaching, or when I was getting pressure to bleach from family members, and be like, oh, you only be so much prettier if you're just a little bit lighter. I have friends or childhood friends that I grew up with that took that route to make their life a little bit easier. I think that show I appreciated, and also too, I think I really appreciate the space that I held for our LGBTQI communities, even though the backlash was tremendous. But the fact that there was another group that I was able to give privilege to, and there were people there too that learned, right? As much as there were those xenophobic, homophobic, community members that we both have, both in Eritrea and Ethiopia, there were people that actually came to learn. And in that space, I turned off the comments, and I just forced people to listen.
I love hearing you speak on this experience. Obviously, I don't love hearing the exact experiences you've gone through, but you just speak with everything with such a level of grace and with that professor lens. You have a way of just teaching through your storytelling. And obviously, I posted about the young East African girl archetype. And I think that something that you've been saying is, going home, you are being called Barya, Baricho, which means literally slave. In Ethiopian Eritrea, they're like, oh, it's just a joke. Don't take it seriously. It's just a nickname.
No, that nickname thing, right? I ended up not going on a date with a guy because he was like, what's wrong with, I have sisters that I call Barichos. Literally, I ended up not going on a date because I'm like, if you can't even see your own sister experience, then you're gaslighting me and then fetishizing me, right? Because now it's become a thing of, oh yeah, I went out with this girl from Gambele.
It's real, because it's I think that's what's so hard is when people share their experiences, especially women, especially the more marginalized you get, you're silenced, you're being told that you didn't experience that, you're being told it's not that bad, you're being, everything. So thank you for sharing, and just it's really incredible. I do want to call out, you said you didn't bleach your skin. You've been holding these stories. That takes a lot of courage. And yeah, the more I learn, the more I admire and respect your journey. So thank you so much for sharing.
It's funny, being in Ghana, people always guess everywhere but East Africa for me. Right? At least some people be like, okay, Kenya? They're like, but you don't have the forehead. Not all of us have the forehead.
How is this whole region supposed to look the same? That's my question.
Yeah, so for me, it was like, okay. But then some people that are kind of, familiar to geography and have done a little bit of study of the continent, they'll get closer. And then it completely blows them away when I said I'm Ethiopian. But you're dark skin. Is in Haile Selassie, Ethiopia? I'm like, Is in Menelik, Ethiopia. Those that haven't educated themselves about the continent, then their mind is just blown because what they've seen of Ethiopia is not me, like I have said earlier. So it's been interesting, but I get the forehead thing. You don't have the forehead. They'd be like, oh, but you're South Sudanese, but you're not tall. What happened to you? I'm like, South Sudan has 64 ethnic groups. It's not everybody that's tall in South Sudan. So relax. What you see on TikTok and all of that is not the majority of the people. So it's been interesting. I feel like I'm always, before I even came into becoming a formal educator, I was an informal educator because I felt like I'm always teaching people from a white supremacy lens or from a colonial lens. Yeah.
That's real. That's real. Is there ever a point where you're just like, it is what it is, and I'm not explaining this?
Yeah. I think that definitely when I get into Ubers and they're like, "Where are you from?" I'll just be like, "Oh, I'm from I'm from the northern region of Ghana. Kwame Nkrumah's people. They're called Nzimas. They're pretty dark skinned, and so I normally just say I'm Nzima." And then one time the guy was like, "Oh, you don't speak your language, huh? Those of you that have gone to the diaspora, oh, shame on you," and da da da.
You couldn't even get relief there. I'm like, I was trying to end the.
I'm like, you know what? I'm like, it's okay. My people didn't teach me my language, so I'm going to read something that I need to read for the meeting you're driving me to. Is that okay, boss? Okay.
I mean, if it makes you feel any better, as an Eritrean, I deal with that a lot in DC too. They'll look at me and they'll be like, "You don't speak Amharic?" And I'm like, "Not everyone speaks Amharic. How about that?" I feel you. That's so funny. Well, I guess like I've spoken a lot and my audience has heard a lot about fetishization from the Habesha lens. You referenced fetishization as a dark-skinned woman. Can you speak a little bit more on that? And it sounded like it was particularly within the Ethiopian context.
Oh, fetishization. Oh my God. Like I have a really good circle of sisters, and we unpack all of these conversations over wine, over Prosecco, you know. And one of the conversations that we really unpack is this, right? The fetishization of it, because I'm always the darkest person in my friend groups, or, you know, in the spaces that I'm in, or not the darkest, the most sun-kissed, as we say. The sun kissed me a little bit extra. I was like, And then I have friends that are your complexion or that are biracial, right? That we come from the other spectrum, where in the colonial colonized mindset of, let's just speak on the romantic sense of men, you know, fetishizing us, you know, my friends that are on the other spectrum of Black, or the beginning spectrum, the light spectrum of Black, they get fetishized for their proximity to whiteness. And then I'm at the other spectrum where they're like, yo, you're like the original woman, right? Like you haven't been on tap. Like I remember in Philly, oh God, in Pennsylvania, I used to keep a note on my compass, on my notepad, and it was entitled A Melanin Tale. And I would write down the clever things that people have said that I haven't heard. From any given day, I can go to, dang, you a queen, like you for real queen, like Mama Africa queen. Or I go to, you dark as shit. There is no middle ground. Like, honestly, there's no middle ground. Like, this is white supremacy lens, colorism, and fetishization. I remember I was taking a trolley to go meet a couple of friends, and this guy was like, yo, chocolate. You know, I like chocolate. And I just acted like I didn't know English. So then he started speaking louder, because clearly if he spoke louder, I would understand. This guy was like, hey, yo, Ma, I'm not disrespecting you or nothing like that. Like, I'm just saying, you beautiful, you know, you black chocolate. I like chocolate cake. So I just looked at him like, English? No. So then he left. And then there was a sister waiting next to me. She turned around and she had her like Buryan accent give her away. She's like, sister. I said, She's like, I'm sorry. I know you spoke English and you just didn't want to deal with all of that shenanigan. I was like, I know. I'm trying to go out with my girls and have a couple of drinks. I'm not trying to deal with this. But even here in Ghana, like regardless of wherever I go into, there's always going to be somebody that's going to be like, I like your color.
Even on the continent.
Oh, the continent is even worse. The proximity to whiteness, like colonization has done a number on the continent. West Africa, where in East Africa, I think because we see so much of ourselves, right? South Sudanese, Kenyans, those of us that are, South Sudanese, Ethiopian, being in the capital, we don't, you can compliment somebody, but West Africa, unless, Senegalese are coming in and Senegalese look like South Sudanese. But yeah, on any given day, somebody be like, Madam, I like your color.
I'm really surprised to hear that in West Africa, you're hearing it more than East Africa, because I would assume that you would be surrounded by more people similar to your complexion.
They are, but they're not. So it's interesting how we also know that you're not from the environment, because I guess the sun kissed us differently. So because I remember I was like, but they are Ghanaians that are dark skinned, that are my complexion. They'd be like, no, but your black is shiny. And I also get it, right? I understand it, because even in South Sudan, there is those, I can't really articulate it in English, because in Nuer, it's like, like your skin is smooth. There's a dark smoothness, and then there's the rough smoothness, whatever that means. But we can tell. So it's interesting, because even with that, there is level of no, your skin is different than our skin. So I guess it could be also the terrain and the environment, that they know that my skin do not grow up under this environment. It comes from a different environment.
I listened recently to a West African photographer. Her name is Siane, and she was on Black Shutter podcast, which is it's a podcast focused on Black photographers based here in Brooklyn. And it was amazing. And this episode, I really loved it because she focused on colorism and representation in photography and the lack of dark-skinned women in West African photography. So I wasn't really planning to touch on this really, but I would love to hear how your experiences with colorism differ in Africa versus the United States.
I remember there's a book by Layla. I forgot her name, but the book is called Me and the White Supremacy. So I teach from that book. And I read that book, but from a privileged perspective. And that's when it really opened my eyes in my workspace when it comes to colorism. And I've realized that even being in management position, that I had to have other light-skinned women be my allies in some of the meetings that I was in. But to come to the continent, again, colonization has done a number on our people. Nigeria holds number one in terms of the amount of skin bleaching products. I believe the last I read, 77% of Nigerians bleach.
Wow.
In Ghana, I don't know the statistic per se, but just observing and being in the community, many Ghanaian women bleach, and they have actually upgraded to taking melanin blocking pills and also injections.
How recent has that developed?
I mean, in the last 5 years or a decade or so. It's been quite interesting. I remember I was low on like B12 and vitamin C. I went to go get some infusion, and then I was speaking to the doctor, and I was like, okay, your clinic, what does it do? She's like, a lot of women come in to do infused bleaching. I was like, what? Doc, tell me more. So the affluent women in this society tend to do the pills, tend to do the injections, because then it'll help with the knuckles, with the elbows, instead of like the traditional lotions. I remember there was a party I went to with one of my adopted sister. She was DJing. It was like during Dirty December, and it was a birthday party. And so we went, and I can count on one hand those of us that were dark skinned, and me being the darkest in that party. All of the women were either biracial or they were light skinned, whether it's over the counter light skin or God given light skin, that's their prerogative. And majority of the men were dark skinned. So I remember I texted one of my friends. She is biracial, Liberian, Italian. And I was just texting her. I was like, oh my God, like I can count us in one hand. She was like, in West Africa, colonization has done a number on us in terms of our proximity to whiteness. The higher you go in society, the lighter the women become. The continent, again, is still very much colonized mentally in terms of the European beauty standards. I remember when I first came to Ghana, I was a little bit slimmer than I am now, and it was a craft fashion week, and I went on a couple of calls. And I remember they were like, oh my God, your walk is amazing and da 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 da, but you're plus size. I was like, what? It was also really interesting that even in the modeling industry, we're still using white supremacy and European measurements as well. When the African woman has a behind and has boobies, and we're getting these slender little girls modeling and showing us that this is what the beauty of the continent is, when that's just one of our structure and frames. That's not the majority of the women in the continent.
The responsibility of women in this is also something that's very delicate, because at the same time that we are being fetishized and oppressed and challenged in our identity, and both of us have expressed just, I mean, I don't even know if we can express on this call alone just like the frustration that comes with that experience. We also raise the next generation, whether we have children from our wombs or not. People learn from women. People value culture and art from women. And of course, anyone can create these things, but historically, in the way that society is going to enforce these roles, women are the ones that carry that forward. So I do think that as much as we need to hold men to account, and I've been so pleasantly surprised to see Habesha men defending me in my TikTok comments. Of course, there's the ones attacking me, but I see the ones defending me. As much as we need to hold men to account, and they definitely need to grow, I think women also need to hold ourselves accountable for what we tolerate, right? Are we accepting the fetishization? Because that's not just our experiences. We're opening the door for that man to continue, for that man to tell his friends, hey, I did this, and to continue that behavior. And with colorism, I think something that really, really frustrates me with Habesha women, and I can say that I've experienced this, is like we play into it. And I think that's also something that's hard to talk about, because how much of that is nature versus nurture, right? Poetic Justice, Young East African Girl, I did the math, that came out when I was 12 years old. If I'm being tagged Young East African Girl and I'm not thinking about the implications, like, of course, like, and I really highlight that lyric as well because it's just notable. I don't really care that much about the song, but we can't deny the impact. So yeah, I really just wanted to highlight the significance of the conversation and everything that you've shared so far, because this is some really deep content, and I don't think we're doing it's full justice, but the fact that we're even able to hold this space to speak on it is something I don't take for granted. I'll pause. I said a lot. Do you want to add anything?
No. I just want to reiterate what you said in terms of us women holding ourselves accountable, because again, it was the aunties that were like, oh, bringing me bleaching creams and saying you would just be much prettier if you were just a little bit lighter. Really having those intergenerational dialogues with each other, and what does that mean? Because again, beauty standards were completely different when we were untouched by colonization and by white supremacy and by media and all of these things. My piercing here is not for fashion. This is cultural. The newer women have piercing and they have a long piece that they wear. And so I remember when I did my piercing and they were like, oh, are you trying to be, these? I'm like, I'm just going back to my roots. This was beauty for us. This is beauty for us. So I remember one of my friends were like, oh, but when you go for job interviews, like, are you going to have to take that out? I said, no, I'm not, because this is part of my cultural identity. I'm just going to show up. And if they say no because I have it, then they can just miss out on me. As much as we hold men accountable, we also need to hold ourselves accountable, because the biggest thing is that when women get ready and get dressed to go out, we're not dressing for the men. We're dressing for the other women. We're dressing for the other women, because somebody's going to clock you and be like, yeah, she look good, but her shoes. That auntie be like, trauma.
But don't you think that micromanaging or that like extreme attention to detail is because of the male gaze to an extent?
It is to a certain extent, but then we have added to it.
It's true.
Then now it's the whole, oh, we listen, we don't judge. We judge. I think also in that sense is decolonizing your mind, of stepping out in your true authentic self, of like, okay, I'm going to step out in my full identity, which a lot of people are not there in our community, both in Ethiopia and Eritrea. They're not.
I want to give pause to the fact that that's something I've really, from the moment I met you, you embodied that fullness. And even on this call, the fact that you just said if they don't like my piercing, they can miss out on me. I don't want to minimize how significant it is to make that boundary and that decision to stand in your truth. And to your point, a lot of people don't have that strength. And I think if you're in Ethiopia and Eritrea, or you recently left, the fact of the matter is your life is at risk if you do that. And so I don't want to minimize that either. As someone born and raised in the diaspora, I don't have those worries or that trauma of fear around that.
We have a privilege, that privilege of we can talk and we can say and we can be, where you're not in a homogenous community, that also that you have to kind of follow the line, and you can color outside the line, you can walk outside the line for your safety. But then how do you also find self within that? Because you can, right? Regardless of how physically you might be oppressed, you can still mentally be free and free yourself if you want to. For me, this hasn't always been me. But if I hadn't found me and say, okay, I'm going to be me and live this once, you know, as much as every day we said, oh, you only got one life to live, you only got one life to live. Are you really living it, or are you just existing? I don't want to give myself the disservice of not living in my authenticity. When you're living in your authentic self, it doesn't also mean that you're dimming other people's light. It actually means, okay, my light is shining and there's other people's lights that are shining. And if we get together, it's just going to be a brighter, you know, light, because my lamp may only light just a single way, and yours, we add another sister, we may light the whole road together. I tell the young women that I mentor, that I teach, the young men as well, that you got to find self, whatever self is, and have that journey. If you're physically confined to have that journey mentally.
That's the best part about identity conversations, is by acknowledging one's identity, we can acknowledge how we are so much more than our identity and the way that we show up in these bodies. So you have had a very, very, very colorful life. I would love to hear what experiences you draw on most when making these intercultural connections, and what your priority is in cultural storytelling at the moment.
Priority. Let me just start with my priority, because I'm looking for funding for my priority. To actually research and whole Indigenous knowledges. We're losing it with the lack of intergenerational conversation, because we're dealing with our traumas. We're dealing with not listening to each other because we're unpacking so much, but we're losing so much history. And if history is not learned, it's not protected, it's not restored, it's going to repeat itself. We're oral tradition storyteller. I want to keep that, having conversations. So currently, one of the things that I really want to do is record restorative justice processes as a people. That's one of my passion right now. But then it's again, like what you're doing is the storytelling of us telling our stories to be seen, to be heard, because I'm sure there's two beautiful young girls that are probably our complexion somewhere in the world that would be able to see us having this dialogue, a healthy dialogue, and feel seen, feel recognized. And it may be a young man that is like, oh, wow, I've never realized that my preference in the women that I date is steeped in neo-colonization or steeped in colorism and how I see myself, because it's not just women also, right? Men do get affected by colorism and fetishization. It's like one season, the light-skinned men are in right now with Aaron, you know, Pierre, that's Mufasa.
Okay, but they got the marketing down with that one. Like,
they did. They did. Back in the days, let me age myself a little bit with Tay Diggs, you know, and
Denzel.
You know, and the other brother, what's his name? Bald-headed. No, Morris Chestnut. Yes. Because Shamar Moore was coming out like he's on the light-skinned side, brother. You know, so again, in Hollywood, there's always been this switch. You know, one season is light-skinned man, next season is dark-skinned man. Women perpetrating what men also perpetrate to us. So again, it's a conversation we need to have.
There's our fragmented relationships with these Black men because of this. There's the way that they play into it. So that's why I tend to not touch on it, because I'm like, this is a Pandora's box. This is not the internet. I'm not stewarding this conversation well, but I do just want to call attention to the fact that like you said, they are very, very fetishized.
Yeah, and I think also too, one thing that I realized traveling in Europe is that dark-skinned women are also hypersexualized as well, the same as men.
And I mean, this is historical. Earlier, when you mentioned our body types, I was thinking about, that sketch. I need to know the exact story, but basically I believe it was like a woman from South Africa. I think it was the British brought her and were showing off like as a show pony, right? Yeah, and it was just so degrading. The animation was just very hyperbolic, like huge breasts, huge booty. And, obviously we see how that plays out in today's media, but also in my experience in college, I was working at a reception at this, gift shop I was working at. And I remember my manager was trying to get behind me, and she literally told me not to stand like with my back so out. Made the gesture like I was in front of a customer, there was a line, she was trying to get behind me, and she's like, could you not stand like this? And she like arches her back fully. So these things very much play out in how our bodies are perceived today, and like just the hypersexualization of the Black body, I feel like could be its own novel. I feel like
it is, it completely is. And you were talking about Sarah Bartman, and Erica Badu recently showed up on stage with kind of like that bodysuit. Again, we don't live on an island. We live in community. And so it's also letting our brothers know that as much as we're dealing with this, we also see you, that you're dealing with it. It's how you all process that you're going to have to unpack, as we are unpacking how we process that. What was your question again? Because I was like, yay, restorative justice, storytelling, woo. And then we went into the other.
I would love to hear your thoughts on restorative justice in the current context of what's happening. And I'm going to leave that so open because you could really, whatever speaks to you in that question.
Right now, it's been really heavy because my people are under attack, as in the newer people in South Sudan, my ancestral land. So every day I literally pray that I will find my father's grave not untouched by the bombs and the airstrike that is happening in Nasser. Restorative justice, it can happen when there's active war. We have to talk about ceasefire, right? We got to talk about ceasefire. We got to talk about making sure that the women, the children, the disabled, the vulnerables are somehow being protected before we can really go into having conversations. In all of the conflicts that are happening, our African men and their egos. Like I tell people, bring African women together, the solution will be found. Because at the end of the day, we're the one losing our husbands, we're the one losing ourselves, we're the one losing our children, and so forth. So we know what it feels like. And of course, the infamous African proverbs is when two elephants are fighting, it's the grass that gets hurt, right? We're the grass in this context. When these men are fighting for position per se. In the context of South Sudan, these leaders, all of the leaders, their children are either in Kenya or they're abroad, or they're in Addis. They're not in South Sudan. Regarding restorative justice right now, is not feasible until leaders are willing to say, you know what, I see the humanity of all of my people. Also, leader not looking at power to oppress, but looking at power to actually heal and to undo all of these things that have been done. Because again, your generations are growing up with all of these harm, with all of these trauma. It's just trying to get by daily and trying to send light to the darkest spaces in our world. And yeah.
Thank you for sharing. I want to first acknowledge your losses. And I'm really sorry that your family is experiencing the detriment of the conflict.
Yeah.
I want to say that I really admire your focus on the future, I should say, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like being realistic, like within this context, ideally we would be focused on restorative justice, but like you said, it's like life and death. You need to focus on ceasefire. Mm-hmm. In these instances, you have dedicated your life, your work to justice, to representation. And like, as we've been discussing, this work is exhausting and can at times put you at risk and puts you in a more visible position. When we're discussing these things, how do you maintain your wellness and your sense of motivation?
You know what? Being in Ghana, I found my tears. You have to cry. You have to let it go. You have to physically. I know that we come from a community that is like, oh, you're not supposed to cry. That's weakness and whatnot. I found my tears. I am a Sagittarius, so we are lovers of the world, lovers of just humor. And I think also because of what I've gone through, I tend to use a lot of humor. I talk to God, I talk to the ancestors, I burn it on. My friend can say, girl, I'll be burning it on. I'm like, woo. If I need to unplug, I like to travel. I also need to recenter myself quarterly to just go and be like, okay, decompress. One of the lessons that I teach in one of my courses, my conflict transformation courses, is checking your emotional cup. Is your emotional cup so full that a single drop will spill and it will affect everything else in your life? What activities can you do to be emptying out your emotional cup as some is pouring in? Before you know it, you could say something to me and then I'm being nasty to you, you not realizing that it's not you. It is because my emotional cup has spilled. As somebody with PTSD, our communities, we don't like to give out our diagnosis. I have PTSD. And that's because it's not my own fault. I survived 2 wars as a child, and then also displacement and being an immigrant in the US and all of these things. Not everything can be medicated. You also have to do some of the work. So that's what I do in terms of wellness.
I really love the emotional cup analogy because I think something that, again, you being a teacher, what I'm hearing is you really automated and created a system for your wellness. And that's something that I started talking about a little bit online, was the importance of discipline and how that's an act of self-love, and how what you just illustrated, it's important to be disciplined with your self-care as well. And I think that kind of connects to one of my questions I have for you. It's a bit out of the blue, but it came up. Is that, within these conversations, we've had some very serious conversations today around, colorism, representation, and fetishization. But as we talk about wellness, and, you mentioned wanting to dress up and look good. I also love, I wore some makeup this morning. I love dressing up. How can we hold space for vanity in a system and in a world that, is giving us all these crappy experiences we're not trying to deal with? And in one sense, this is exactly what it is. Both of us look cute on this call and we're existing. And that in and of itself, existence is resistance. But also, for those young women watching us, as they can resonate with maybe some of the more negative experiences that we've had, can you speak a little bit more to, what does vanity look like for you?
Beauty, you have to find it first with yourself, right? Finding beauty didn't come so easy, right? Because I didn't see myself. So one of my goals in Ghana is to end up in a really big advertisement and have billboards all over, so that, my 16-year-old self can see myself on a national campaign. But find what you like about you and then start from there. When I dress good, I look good, I feel good. I came into my Pan-African self at a very young age. So I've always wore African prints, right? So I have my Habesha camises, I have, different African prints. I try to find different materials from the continent, because I'm like, when I show up in any space, even if there's a blind person in that space, they need to know there's an African woman in that space. Going back to wellness and looking at my mental health, I did realize that during the winter, I do wear a lot of dark colors because I was dealing with seasonal adverse disorder, SAD. I discovered that during COVID, because during the summer, I'm always outside, going to festivals, hosting festivals. So I was collecting my vitamin D from the sun, and then my fruits and veggies and all of these things. But then during COVID, when we were not out and about, that's when it hit me. And luckily, I had a beautiful sister that was my therapist. She sister, do you see how melanated you are? You need the sun. But for me, it's basically loving yourself first. It's easy to say, it's difficult to do, because there are some days you may not love yourself, but give yourself grace to love yourself. Be your first love. And then other people can love you, and other people will love you. It's doing that work, because the world is going to tell you otherwise. So you have to do that preventative work. It's that shield that you have to put. I was in Philly and I walk out and somebody's like, "Ooh, you dark as shit." I'd be like, "You're jealous because the sun kissed me." God did not make a mistake when God made me.
And you really hit the nail on the head, is like, at the same time, these very real systems of oppression exist based on our appearance. Radical accountability is powerful, right? If you love yourself, and like, if I approach you and I'm like smiling and I have great energy, how can you not smile back?
No, but when you know self, you can never be threatened by anybody else, right? You cannot be insecure when you step into spaces. When you're rooted in self, it doesn't mean that I'm any better than anybody else. It's just that I love myself. Dark-skinned women, we tend to be projected upon that when we're in spaces where we're the only one and our beauty is not seen, or the whole thing like, oh, but you pretty for a dark skin, is that we're supposed to dislike light-skinned women. Like, for what? You're beautiful in your own right. I'm beautiful in my own right. And we keep it moving. That's it. When vanity or beauty becomes an issue is when now you're trying to go oppress other people. When your self-love ends up becoming somewhat of a self-hate and you're trying to be superior, right? The superiority complex. And I see that a lot with Habesha women because the notion that they've been propped up so much that, oh, you're, let's say the stereotype Ethiopian woman is that you're the it. There's nobody else. A quick story. My sister and I, she lives in Falls Church, Virginia. Like, when we were in our 20s, before she had my nieces and nephew, a friend of ours came from Canada, and that area in Falls in Alexandria, what is it called? Where all of the Ethiopian shops are, because that's where I get
Skyline.
Skyline, yeah.
DMV girl, I knew.
Line, that's where I go get my injera. When I used to do my undergrad in Nebraska and I would come visit my sister, my carry-on would be nothing but injera because I can only do tough injera. Yeah, I remember friends of ours, we were at this bar and we're just kind of chilling, drinking, and there were two waitresses literally having a conversation, but Amaranya, talking about, oh, who are these dark-skinned girls that think, they're with our good-looking men, and not knowing that we understand Amharic. And of course, again, they threw out Nyamal Barya, who are these slaves? So I'm like, Unjiye in Danish. They're like, did she just say something in Amharic? I was like, ow. And I was just like, so who is the Barya? Oh, no, Ikerta, wasn't you? And we're like, can we see your manager? Because, yeah. And I was like, yeah, we're Ethiopians. Young women in particular and young men need to know that love yourself enough that you can love other without being insecure about yourself, without being intimidated. If you're authentically yourself in a space, you're more likely are going to not only add to the space, but add so much to your life. I don't ever show up in my title because that's what I do. That's not who I am and the essence of who I am. But then again, we live in a world where people love titles. So I was at an event recently and somebody tried to challenge me. And I said, okay, can we have a side conversation? Again, as an African, I'm like, let's have a side conversation. We will not call each other out because just because you did it doesn't mean I have to do it, right? This particular gentleman was like, oh, if we're going to talk about borderless Africa and Pan-African, we shouldn't be using these colonial borders to introduce ourselves. You should just introduce yourself as an African. I said, yes. And I'm also very proud to be an Ethiopian woman, to be a South Sudanese woman. This is modern day context. Do you want me to tell you, I'm from Kush, ancient Kush? Will you be able to understand that? Will you be able to understand Abyssinia? I just showed him my name tag. He said, oh, Prof, I'm so sorry. I teach identity. You don't need to tell me. Throughout the rest of the event, now that these few letters are in front of my name, that man was able to respect me.
When you speak, you say so many things that really light me up. And I'm so excited to share this conversation because I think there's so much that I'm not going to expand on because I'm sure people in the comments are really going to call it out. And it's just you are really speaking truth to power in your testimonies right now. But what I want to call out is we are in modern day Africa, right? This is where we are. And I think something you said earlier that it has been on my mind was this idea of when we move forward as a continent and undoing the harm that has been done, restorative justice. Something that frustrates me around African rhetoric, especially I think in artistic and academic spaces, is this idea of just constantly talking about what it was like before colonialism. I get so tired because I'm like, y'all, we are in 2025. My country, which was colonized by Italy, has now been 30 plus years independent.
Yeah.
And at the same time that we're talking about the impact of white supremacy and colonialism, that is very, very, very real. I think part of the apathy and part of the difficulty in being in the human rights space is our leaders are the ones we need to hold accountable.
Yeah.
And that's like a whole different conversation, but I think it just speaks to what you were just saying. It's like, yes, it's so important to recognize our history, to recognize our roots, and it's a blessing to know our ancient kingdoms and our ancient civilizations, but we are also in a modern civilization that we are actively creating and that these conversations are actively shaping.
We tend to forget to imagine the future. You have to know the past to know, our infamous proverb, you have to know where you come from for you to know where you're going. Those that live in the past live in depression. Those that live in the future live in anxieties. I love the feminist spaces because we're learning, we've unlearned, and we are relearning to imagine what our reality looked like. Our reality, like you said, resistant looks different. For me, resistant is this. Showing up as an African woman, that's resistant. I don't need to talk about it. Our hair is politicized. The way we dress is politicized. And so I just show up like this. If you don't like it, all right, let's have play. So we can reimagine. We can reimagine the solution through that lens. And we're not just militant lens of, we gotta fight, fight, fight. In the fight, we can laugh. In the fight, we can cry. During the fight, we can love. I'm like, when wars are happening, people are still making babies. People are still getting married. We're still living. So how do you, yeah, so for me, it was interesting. It was really, really interesting.
I think the more specific the context, the more universal the messages, which is so beautiful about storytelling. But any last thoughts that you would like to share?
I'm always preaching about finding your authentic self, regardless of whatever space you may find yourself. Do that self-discovery journey, whether it's through reading, whether it's through friends, whether it's through watching something. When we stop learning is when things become dangerous. When you stop being open-minded is when things become dangerous. And we are kind of seeing that in the US right now. For those of us that call the US home, is some of our community members are learning to stop learning about others. And for the fear monger to coming to us, because again, systems love to use fear to pin us against each other. And as somebody that has seen what othering could do, is very dangerous, because othering does take humanity, does take away how you look at somebody else's humanity. I would encourage everybody, whether it's in our communities, the Ethiopian, Eritrean, South Sudanese, the whole African community, is to be intentional about how do we now start seeing each other, and how do we start, particularly in the US context, protecting each other. Let's all just learn to see the humanity in all of us. And with that, love. You can love me even if you don't like me.
Thank you so much for your time. I really enjoyed this conversation. I appreciate you holding space, even though we are in different time zones and it took some coordinating. And also, can you let people know where they can find you?
IG as Nyamal, NYAMAL_Tudeal, TUTDEAL. And that name, if you type it up, you should be able to find me. It's also on LinkedIn. I just got onto the Stack. What is it? Slapstack?
Oh, Substack. And the Stack. Substack, yes.
Yes, I just got on there because I started like writing now a little bit. I'm writing bits and pieces. If you slide into my DMs, I'm very open, and you can reach me. I'm reachable. I'm not intimidating. Thank you so much for holding space and for, being intentional about reaching out and having this conversation with me. Definitely your intentionality is high point. And for just having the space for us to talk about the issues that are facing us in whatever sense it is. I know that is difficult as a storyteller when you're telling stories that are not of the popular opinion. You have a sister that you can always reach out to just kind of add a little bit more water into your emotional cup if it's empty. So thank you for that as well.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that.
You're welcome.
Everyone, please let us know what you thought in the comments. As you can see, this is a very enriching combo. I feel like I have a lot to really sit with and meditate on as well. And really looking forward to all the feedback. So if you watched to the end, thank you so much. I'll leave all of the information on Nyamal's social media, my social media, and the Habesha project below. And with that, I'll see y'all next time.
Ciao.